Blood dripped from Terrell Washington's lips as he collapsed in the aisle. Flight attendant Samantha Butler smirked, wiping her hands clean. "I warned you about complaining," she whispered. As passengers screamed and the plane descended for emergency landing, no one realized this incident would expose decades of airline discrimination nationwide. Before we dive into this shocking story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to join our community of truth seekers. This story about what happened on Atlantic Sky Airlines Flight 247 will make you question everything you thought you knew about air travel safety. The day had started like any other for Dr. Terrell Washington. At 35, he had already established himself as one of Atlanta's most respected neurosurgeons. With his crisp white coat hanging in his office and his credentials from Johns Hopkins University proudly displayed on his wall, Terrell represented excellence in every sense of the word. He had pioneered a revolutionary brain surgery technique that reduced recovery time by 40%, something that had earned him international recognition in the medical community. But today, exhaustion pulled at his eyelids as he rushed through Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Terrell had just completed a 36-hour shift, the final hours spent in a delicate operation saving a 7-year-old girl with a rare brain tumor. The surgery had been successful, but it had left him drained, both physically and emotionally. Still, there was no time to rest. He had to catch Atlantic Sky Airlines Flight 247 to San Francisco, where he was scheduled to deliver a keynote address at a prestigious medical conference the next morning. Terrell's brisk walk through the terminal drew occasional glances. At 6'2" with broad shoulders and impeccable posture, he cut an impressive figure even in his exhausted state. His navy blue suit remained unwrinkled despite his marathon hospital shift, a testament to his meticulous nature. Despite his success, Terrell never forgot his roots in South Atlanta, where he still volunteered twice monthly at underprivileged clinics, providing care to those who could never afford his services at the prestigious Atlanta Medical Center. When Terrell reached the gate, the boarding process had already begun. He presented his first-class ticket to the gate agent, who barely looked up as she scanned his boarding pass. "Cutting it close, aren't we?" she remarked with a hint of judgment that made Terrell wonder if other passengers had received the same comment. As he made his way down the jet bridge, Terrell mentally prepared for the 5-hour flight ahead. He desperately needed sleep before his presentation, and the first-class seat he'd splurged on seemed worth every penny right now. "Welcome aboard," greeted the lead flight attendant at the aircraft door, her smile disappearing slightly as her eyes met Terrell's. He had grown accustomed to these subtle changes, these small moments where warmth cooled inexplicably upon seeing his face. Samantha Butler had been with Atlantic Sky Airlines for 15 years. At 43, her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her uniform immaculate, and her makeup flawless. She had built a reputation among her colleagues as efficient, detail-oriented, and extremely particular about how her cabin was run. What most passengers didn't see was how that particularity often manifested differently depending on who sat in her seats. As Terrell settled into 2A, a plush window seat in the first-class cabin, he noticed Samantha offering pre-departure beverages to the passengers in 1A and 1B, both white businessmen who had boarded before him. When she reached his row, her eyes slid past him to serve the white woman in 2B first. "Champagne, water, or orange juice?" Samantha asked the woman with a warm smile. "Champagne, please," replied the woman, who then returned to her magazine. Terrell waited patiently, but Samantha turned to leave without acknowledging him. "Excuse me," Terrell said politely. "Could I get some water, please?" Samantha turned back, her smile now tight and professional. "Of course. I'll be right back with that." She returned 3 minutes later, long after serving everyone else in the cabin, with a plastic cup of water rather than the glass tumblers the other first-class passengers had received. Terrell noticed but said nothing. These were the small indignities he had learned to navigate throughout his life and career. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Terrell reclined his seat slightly and closed his eyes, hoping to catch at least a short nap before meal service began. But sleep proved elusive as the cabin crew bustled about preparing the first-class dining experience that Atlantic Sky advertised as restaurant-quality service at 35,000 feet. Terrell had specifically ordered a seafood meal when booking his ticket 2 months prior. As someone with particular dietary preferences, he always made sure to plan ahead. He could smell the warm aroma of food as Samantha and her colleague Michael Torres began meal service. Michael, a 28-year-old flight attendant with 3 years at the airline, handled the port side of the cabin while Samantha took the starboard side where Terrell sat. Terrell observed how Michael engaged warmly with each passenger, remembering their drink preferences and chatting amiably as he served their meals. When Samantha reached Terrell's row, she served the woman in 2B first again. "Here's your chicken confit, Ms. Davis. And can I get you another glass of wine?" The woman nodded appreciatively, and Samantha poured generously from a bottle of California Chardonnay. Terrell waited expectantly for his pre-ordered seafood option. When Samantha made no move to serve him, he spoke up again. "I believe I pre-ordered the seafood option when I booked my ticket," he said. Samantha's expression shifted to one of mild annoyance. "I don't have any record of special meal requests for this seat." "I have the confirmation right here," Terrell said, reaching for his phone to show her the email from Atlantic Sky. Samantha barely glanced at the screen before responding. "Our system must have dropped it. We're almost out of meal choices, but let me see what's left." Terrell watched as she served the remaining white passengers in first class, noting that several seemed to receive their first choice of meal. The cabin wasn't full, and he could clearly see that multiple meal options were still available on her cart. After serving everyone else, Samantha returned with a seafood platter that looked markedly different from the carefully arranged meals other passengers had received. The shrimp appeared slightly gray, and the salmon had a dull, rather than vibrant, color. Worst of all, there was a faint but distinct odor emanating from the plate that made Terrell's stomach turn. "This doesn't smell fresh," Terrell said quietly, not wanting to create a scene. Samantha's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "This is the last seafood option we have. If you don't want it, don't eat it," she said, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, implying that he was being difficult. A white businessman across the aisle, Jason Parker, glanced over with a furrowed brow, seemingly noticing the difference in service. Terrell hesitated. He was starving after his long hospital shift, and he knew he needed sustenance before his presentation tomorrow. Surely a small taste wouldn't hurt. He could always stop if it truly was spoiled. With cautious optimism, he cut into the salmon and took a small bite. The taste was immediately off, slightly sour and with a texture that felt wrong. But before he could even signal to Samantha, his body had already begun to react to whatever bacteria had been festering on that plate. The first wave of nausea hit Terrell like a physical blow. His stomach clenched violently, and sweat instantly beaded across his forehead. As a doctor, he recognized the signs immediately. He was experiencing a severe reaction to food contamination. This wasn't just slightly old food, this was dangerously spoiled seafood. "Excuse me," Terrell called out, his voice already strained as dizziness began to cloud his vision. Samantha Butler, who stood barely 10 feet away serving coffee to a white couple in the front row, turned slightly but continued her conversation as if she hadn't heard him. The pain intensified rapidly, spreading from his stomach throughout his abdomen. His medical training told him this was no ordinary food poisoning. The rapid onset suggested a high bacterial load, possibly Staphylococcus aureus or Vibrio parahemolyticus, both common in improperly stored seafood. His body temperature was rising, and the cabin suddenly felt unbearably hot. "Miss, please," he called again, louder this time, his voice cracking slightly. Several passengers looked up from their meals, but Samantha merely glanced in his direction before deliberately turning away to refill a white passenger's wine glass. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked the businessman in 1D, her voice deliberately loud and cheerful, a stark contrast to the cold dismissal she had shown Terrell. Terrell's vision began to blur as he fumbled for his call button. His fingers felt numb and uncooperative as the toxins from the spoiled food began to flood his system. He finally managed to press the button, sending a silent alert to the flight attendants panel. The indicator light flashed at the front of the cabin, but Samantha looked directly at it and continued her conversation with the passengers in the front row, ignoring the summons. Meanwhile, Terrell's condition deteriorated with frightening speed. He could feel his heart racing, his pulse pounding in his ears as his body fought against the invasion of bacteria. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Terrell pressed the call button repeatedly, each press more desperate than the last. His stomach cramped so severely that he doubled over in his seat, drawing concerned looks from nearby passengers. Jason Parker, the white businessman seated across the aisle in 2C, had been watching the situation unfold with increasing concern. At first, he had tried to mind his own business, but the stark difference in treatment was becoming impossible to ignore. He had seen how attentive Samantha was to other passengers while deliberately ignoring Terrell's increasingly urgent calls for assistance. "Excuse me, miss," Jason finally called out as Samantha passed by. "I think this gentleman needs help." He gestured toward Terrell, who was now visibly trembling, his dark skin taking on an ashen pallor. Samantha's smile remained fixed as she responded, "I'll be with him shortly. We need to finish serving the rest of the cabin first." "He looks sick," Jason insisted, his voice rising slightly. "He's been trying to get your attention for at least 10 minutes. Samantha's expression hardened. "Sir, I understand your concern, but we have procedures to follow." Some passengers, she emphasized with a pointed look toward Terrell, sometimes exaggerate their needs for attention or to get special treatment. The implication was clear, and Jason's face registered shock at the blatant dismissal. By this point, Terrell was struggling to remain conscious. He had begun to vomit, trying desperately to expel the toxic food from his system, but it was too late. The bacteria had already entered his bloodstream. Terrell knew he needed to get to the bathroom. With tremendous effort, he unbuckled his seatbelt and tried to stand. His legs buckled immediately, and he grabbed the seat in front of him to steady himself. The passenger there, a middle-aged white woman, recoiled from his touch, adding another layer of humiliation to his suffering. Taking a deep breath, Terrell pushed himself into the aisle, determined to reach the bathroom just a few rows ahead. He made it only 2 steps before another violent cramp doubled him over. He reached out blindly for support but found none. His knees hit the floor hard, and as he coughed from the impact, bright red blood speckled the blue carpet of the aisle. The sight of blood triggered immediate panic in the cabin. A woman screamed, and several passengers jumped to their feet, creating a chaotic scene. Someone shouted for a doctor, unaware that the man collapsed in the aisle was himself a renowned surgeon. Michael Torres, who had been serving the port side of the cabin, rushed over when he heard the commotion. His eyes widened at the sight of Terrell on the floor, blood now trickling from the corner of his mouth as he fought to remain conscious. "What happened?" Michael demanded, kneeling beside Terrell and quickly assessing his condition with the basic first aid training all flight attendants received. He just collapsed," a passenger offered helplessly. "Did he eat something?" Michael asked, noticing the half-eaten seafood meal still on Terrell's tray table. The seafood, Terrell managed to gasp, his medical training compelling him to provide symptoms even as his body failed him. "Spoiled, anaphylactic." Michael looked up sharply at Samantha, who stood frozen at the edge of the scene, her face a mask of feigned concern that didn't reach her eyes. "Samantha, when was this meal prepared? Did you check the date label?" For a brief moment, something like guilt flickered across Samantha's features before she composed herself. It was part of today's catering. All standard procedures were followed. But Michael's attention had already returned to Terrell, whose breathing was becoming increasingly labored. "We need to get him stable. Does anyone have an EpiPen?" No one responded. Michael pressed the intercom button on the nearest panel. "Captain, this is Michael in first class. We have a severe medical emergency." A passenger is experiencing what appears to be a severe allergic reaction and possible food poisoning. We need to divert immediately. The captain's voice crackled back almost instantly. Understood. Preparing for emergency landing in Denver. ETA 20 minutes. Denver emergency services have been notified and will meet the aircraft. As Michael attended to Terrell, now barely conscious on the floor, several passengers had begun recording the scene on their phones. One captured Samantha in the background, hurriedly removing Terrell's meal tray and disappearing toward the galley. Jason Parker, who had been watching closely, followed her. He arrived at the galley just in time to see Samantha examining the packaging of the seafood meal, where a label clearly showed yesterday's date. She quickly crumpled the packaging and shoved it deep into the trash compartment. "I saw that," Jason said firmly, his phone still recording. "That meal was expired." Samantha spun around, her face flushing with anger. "You have no right to be in this area. Return to your seat immediately." "Not until you explain why you served him expired food and then ignored him when he got sick," Jason countered, standing his ground. Their confrontation was interrupted by the captain's announcement over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a medical emergency on board, we are diverting to Denver International Airport. We expect to land in approximately 15 minutes. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." In the main cabin, Michael had placed Terrell in the recovery position on the floor, using blankets to keep him warm as shock set in. Terrell's consciousness was fading, his breathing shallow and rapid. The front of his once immaculate shirt was now stained with blood and vomit, a stark visual representation of how quickly his dignity had been stripped away. As the plane began its descent toward Denver, the mood in the cabin was tense and fearful. Passengers whispered among themselves, many still recording the scene despite Michael's requests for privacy. Word had spread through the cabin about what had happened, with several passengers who had witnessed Samantha's deliberate neglect openly discussing it. "She ignored him for at least 10 minutes, one passenger told another. "I saw her serve everyone else first," added another. "And did you notice she gave him a different meal than everyone else?" Samantha returned to the cabin, her professional demeanor firmly back in place, though her eyes darted nervously to the phone still recording her every move. She knelt beside Michael as if to assist with Terrell, but Michael's cold stare made it clear her help was not welcome. "I've got this," he said shortly. "Just prepare for landing." As the plane descended toward Denver International Airport, Terrell Washington, a man who had saved countless lives in his operating room, now fought for his own on the floor of Atlantic Sky Airlines Flight 247, unaware that his ordeal was about to expose a pattern of discrimination that would shake the entire airline industry to its core. The wheels of Flight 247 screeched against the runway at Denver International Airport with more force than usual, the aircraft shuddering as the pilot executed an expedited landing. Emergency vehicles lined the tarmac, their lights flashing urgently against the afternoon sun. Inside the cabin, Michael Torres remained crouched beside Terrell, monitoring his deteriorating vital signs while passengers watched in horrified silence. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened," the captain announced as the aircraft taxied rapidly toward the waiting emergency response team. "Medical personnel will be boarding immediately to assist with our emergency. Your cooperation is essential." Within minutes of the aircraft reaching its designated spot, the forward door was thrown open. A team of paramedics rushed aboard, equipment in hand. The lead paramedic, a woman with close-cropped hair and efficient movements, immediately took charge of the scene. "What's his status?" she asked Michael, kneeling beside Terrell's prone form. "Male, mid-30s, consumed contaminated seafood approximately 30 minutes ago," Michael reported quickly. "Severe reaction, possible anaphylaxis on top of food poisoning." He mentioned seafood and anaphylactic before losing consciousness. "He's been unresponsive for about 7 minutes." The paramedic team worked with practiced precision, quickly establishing an 4-line and administering emergency medications. One placed an oxygen mask over Terrell's face while another monitored his heart rate on a portable device. The readings caused visible concern. BP's dropping fast. "We need to move him now," the lead paramedic announced. Within moments, they had transferred Terrell onto a stretcher and were rushing him down the aisle toward the exit. As Terrell was evacuated from the aircraft, a new group of officials boarded, airline representatives in crisp Atlantic Sky uniforms and several airport security personnel. The lead airline representative, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a name badge identifying him as Regional Director Thomas Harrington, addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for this unfortunate situation. We'll be investigating the incident thoroughly. For now, we ask that you remain on board while we gather some initial information." His words were met with immediate resistance from the passengers. "That flight attendant deliberately ignored him," shouted a woman from the fourth row, pointing at Samantha, who stood rigid near the galley. "I have it all on video," added Jason Parker, holding up his phone. "She served him expired food and then refused to help when he got sick." Thomas Harrington's professional smile faltered slightly. "Sir, if you have relevant information, we'd appreciate speaking with you privately." "Everyone should see this," Jason insisted, and several passengers murmured in agreement. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. By now, passengers had begun sharing their videos on social media. One particularly damning clip showed Samantha's repeated ignoring of Terrell's call button and her dismissive comment implying he was seeking attention. Another captured her attempting to dispose of the dated meal packaging. Within hours, these videos would accumulate millions of views and thousands of outraged comments. As the videos spread across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, hashtags began trending. Hashtag Atlantic Sky Racism and hashtag Justice for Terrell quickly rose to the top trending topics nationally. News outlets picked up the story, initially reporting on a medical emergency diversion, but quickly pivoting to the more explosive angle of alleged racial discrimination as the videos circulated widely. Meanwhile, at Atlantic Sky's headquarters in Dallas, executives gathered in an emergency meeting. CEO James Wilson, a 60-year-old industry veteran with a reputation for prioritizing shareholder value above all else, stared in disbelief at the social media storm unfolding on the screen before him. "How bad is this?" he asked the room of tense executives. "Bad," replied the chief communications officer bluntly. "The videos are extremely damaging. Our stock is already down 8% and falling. We need to issue a statement immediately." "What do we know about the flight attendant?" Samantha Butler, the head of human resources, consulted her tablet. 15 years with the company. Generally positive performance reviews, though. She hesitated. "Though what?" Wilson pressed. "There have been 3 passenger complaints about potential racial bias in the past 2 years. All were investigated according to standard procedures and deemed inconclusive." "Meaning they were buried," muttered the general counsel, already anticipating the legal nightmare ahead. Wilson rubbed his temples. "Draft a generic statement. We're deeply concerned, investigating thoroughly, committed to the highest standards, the usual. No admission of fault, no mention of discrimination. Just express concern for the passengers' health." Back in Denver, the situation was escalating. FBI agents had arrived at the airport, responding to reports of a potential federal hate crime. Deliberately endangering a passenger based on race fell under their jurisdiction, and the viral videos provided sufficient cause for preliminary investigation. Inside the aircraft, passengers had begun refusing to continue their journey until the situation was addressed. A standoff developed, with dozens of passengers insisting they would not deplane until justice was served. "We all saw what happened," insisted a middle-aged black woman in business class. "If you try to sweep this under the rug, every person on this plane will be talking to the media within the hour." The tension in the cabin had grown so thick that Thomas Harrington had to retreat to the cockpit to confer with airline headquarters. After a tense conversation, he returned to address the increasingly restless passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, In light of the circumstances, Atlantic Sky has made the decision to ground this aircraft. All passengers will be rebooked on alternate flights to San Francisco or your final destination. Full refunds will be provided to anyone who wishes to cancel their travel plans. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. This announcement was met with a mixture of satisfaction that the airline was taking the situation seriously and continued anger over the incident itself. As passengers began to gather their belongings, Thomas approached Samantha, speaking in low tones. "You'll be escorted off separately by security. Don't speak to anyone, especially the media. The company attorneys will contact you." Samantha's face had lost all color, but indignation still flashed in her eyes. "This is ridiculous. I'm being unfairly targeted because of some videos taken out of context." "Save it for the investigation," Thomas replied curtly. As Samantha was escorted from the aircraft through a rear door, away from the gathered media that had already assembled at the terminal, Atlantic Sky's official statement was released across all platforms. Atlantic Sky Airlines is deeply concerned about the incident on Flight 247 today. The health and safety of our passengers is our highest priority. We are thoroughly investigating the circumstances surrounding this medical emergency and are cooperating fully with authorities. Out of respect for the privacy of those involved, we cannot provide further details at this time. Our thoughts are with the affected passenger and his family. The statement, clearly crafted by crisis management experts to say as little as possible, only fueled public outrage. Social media users quickly pointed out the statement's failure to address the obvious discrimination shown in the videos. At University of Colorado Hospital, Terrell Washington fought for his life in the intensive care unit. The medical team had diagnosed severe food poisoning compounded by an allergic reaction, leading to anaphylactic shock, severe dehydration, and the beginning stages of sepsis. His condition was listed as critical but stable. News of his identity had leaked to the press. Dr. Terrell Washington, award-winning neurosurgeon from Atlanta, pioneer of a revolutionary surgical technique, volunteer at underprivileged clinics. Images of Terrell in his white coat, receiving medical awards, and performing volunteer work in inner-city Atlanta spread across media outlets, creating a powerful contrast to the images of him collapsed and bleeding on the airplane floor. As the day progressed, Atlantic Sky's stock continued its freefall, losing 15% of its value in a single day of trading. Competitors quickly distanced themselves, with several major airlines issuing statements reaffirming their commitment to equal treatment of all passengers. By evening, as Terrell remained unconscious in the ICU, his sister Aisha Washington arrived from Atlanta. A formidable civil rights attorney known for taking on high-profile discrimination cases, Aisha stepped before the bank of microphones outside the hospital with the composed fury of someone accustomed to fighting injustice. "Today, my brother Terrell, a man who has saved countless lives as a neurosurgeon, nearly lost his own due to the deliberate, racially motivated actions of an Atlantic Sky employee. This was not an accident. This was not a mistake. This was a deliberate act of endangerment based on the color of my brother's skin. We will pursue every legal avenue available to ensure that justice is served, not just for Terrell, but for every passenger who has ever experienced discrimination at the hands of this airline or any other." Her powerful statement, delivered with the precision of a seasoned attorney and the passion of a sister fighting for her brother, became the lead story on every major news network that night. As Americans watched the viral videos and learned about Terrell Washington's accomplishments and character, public sentiment crystallized around one undeniable truth: what had happened on Flight 247 was not an isolated incident but a symptom of a much larger problem that could no longer be ignored. The fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit cast harsh shadows across Terrell Washington's unconscious form. Machines beeped rhythmically, monitoring every flutter of his heart and each shallow breath. In the chair beside his bed, Aisha Washington maintained her vigil, her normally impeccable appearance showing signs of strain. Her tailored suit was wrinkled from the hasty flight to Denver, and dark circles had formed beneath her eyes, but her determination remained undiminished. Dr. Kimberly Santos, the lead physician on Terrell's case, entered the room with a tablet in hand and concern etched on her face. Ms. Washington. I have an update on your brother's condition. Aisha straightened immediately. How is he? He's fighting hard, Dr. Santos replied, her voice professional yet compassionate. The food poisoning was severe, caused by bacteria called Vibrio parahemolyticus, commonly found in spoiled seafood. Combined with the allergic reaction, it created a perfect storm in his system. We've stabilized his blood pressure and are treating the infection aggressively with antibiotics, but he's not out of danger yet. Will there be lasting damage? Aisha asked, her attorney's mind already calculating future implications even as her heart ached for her brother. Dr. Santos hesitated. It's too early to say with certainty. The anaphylactic shock restricted oxygen flow briefly, but we're monitoring brain function closely. The next 24 hours will be critical. What neither woman knew was that their conversation was being recorded by a hospital staff member just outside the door. Within hours, details of Terrell's condition would leak to the media, violating his privacy but further fueling the growing national outrage. Outside the hospital, the media presence had grown exponentially. News vans lined the street, reporters delivered live updates, and satellite trucks broadcast the unfolding story to millions of viewers across the country. What had begun as a medical emergency on a routine flight had transformed into a national conversation about racial discrimination in transportation. I'm standing outside University of Colorado Hospital where Dr. Terrell Washington, a prominent neurosurgeon from Atlanta, remains in critical condition, reported a journalist from CNN. Sources inside the hospital confirmed Dr. Washington is suffering from severe food poisoning and anaphylactic shock after allegedly being deliberately served spoiled food on an Atlantic Sky Airlines flight. Across town, in a sterile conference room at Denver International Airport, FBI agents interviewed flight attendant Michael Torres, whose testimony was proving damning to both Samantha Butler and Atlantic Sky Airlines. It wasn't just this incident, Michael explained, his voice tight with suppressed anger. There's a pattern. I've seen Samantha and others treat passengers differently based on race. It's subtle sometimes, but it's consistent. And the meal served to Dr. Washington, prompted the female FBI agent. Michael's expression hardened. The seafood platter served to Dr. Washington was labeled with the previous day's date. All flight attendants are trained to check dates on all meals before serving. It's a basic safety protocol. Samantha knows this. She's been flying for 15 years. Do you believe she deliberately served expired food to Dr. Washington? Michael paused, weighing his words carefully. Based on what I observed that day and her pattern of behavior on previous flights, yes, I believe it was deliberate. Meanwhile, the digital landscape was erupting with activity. A data journalist from ProPublica had published an analysis of Atlantic Sky's customer service metrics, revealing that black passengers filed complaints at a rate 3 times higher than white passengers, and those complaints were resolved satisfactorily at a rate 50% lower. Social media platforms became battlegrounds where the incident was dissected from every angle. Side-by-side comparisons of Atlantic Sky's treatment of white versus black passengers flooded timelines, with users sharing their own experiences of discrimination in air travel and beyond. This isn't just about one flight attendant or one airline, wrote a viral Twitter thread from a black flight attendant at a competing airline. This is about a culture that permeates the entire industry. I've seen it from both sides now, and it's undeniable. The thread accumulated hundreds of thousands of retweets within hours, each personal anecdote adding another brick to the growing wall of evidence that Terrell's experience was part of a systemic problem. As pressure mounted, someone leaked Samantha Butler's social media history to several news outlets. Her private Facebook and Instagram accounts revealed a disturbing pattern of racially insensitive posts and comments dating back years. In one particularly damaging post from 3 years prior, she had complained about being assigned to work flights to and from Atlanta, using coded language that barely disguised her disdain for the predominantly black passengers on those routes. Atlantic Sky's corporate communications team, already overwhelmed by the crisis, now faced an avalanche of inquiries about their hiring and training practices. How had someone with such obvious biases been allowed to serve a diverse customer base for 15 years? What kind of screening and ongoing training did flight attendants receive regarding unconscious bias and racial sensitivity? The answers, it seemed, were not reassuring. Former Atlantic Sky employees began coming forward with accounts of a corporate culture that at best ignored and at worst enabled discriminatory practices. A former human resources manager revealed anonymously that complaints about racial bias were routinely downgraded in urgency and resolution priority compared to other types of customer complaints. The attitude was always, "We can't prove it was about race," so the complaints were dismissed or settled with minimal compensation and non-disclosure agreements, the former employee told the Washington Post. There was never any genuine effort to address the underlying issues. By the second day of the crisis, Atlantic Sky's damage control efforts shifted from denial to appeasement. The airline announced that Samantha Butler had been suspended pending investigation and pledged $1 million to the National Civil Rights Museum. CEO James Wilson released a video statement expressing deep concern about the incident and promising a complete review of our service policies and training programs. The gesture fell flat. Civil rights organizations called it too little, too late. Competing airlines seized the opportunity to highlight their own diversity initiatives and inclusive customer service policies, effectively isolating Atlantic Sky in the marketplace. Have you ever experienced discrimination while traveling? Comment number 1 if you believe Atlantic Sky should be held accountable for systemic discrimination, not just this single incident. Hit that like button if you think all airlines need better oversight and training on equal treatment, and subscribe to stay updated on this developing story. Do you think the transportation industry as a whole needs reform to address these issues, or is this problem unique to certain companies? Let us know your thoughts as we continue exploring what happened in the hospital and the growing nationwide response. At University of Colorado Hospital, a small breakthrough occurred late that night. Terrell Washington opened his eyes briefly, though he remained too weak to speak. Aisha was at his side, her hand clasping his as he drifted between consciousness and sleep. The medical team cautiously upgraded his condition from critical to serious but stable. While Terrell fought for recovery, Aisha discovered something disturbing. Through her legal connections, she obtained information about Atlantic Sky's history of settling discrimination cases. Over the past decade, the airline had quietly paid out over $12 million across 27 separate cases, all sealed with strict non-disclosure agreements. The pattern was clear. Rather than address the root causes of discrimination within the company, Atlantic Sky had simply paid to make the problems disappear. This revelation would prove crucial in the days ahead, as it transformed the narrative from one isolated incident to evidence of a corporate culture built on concealment rather than correction. The story was no longer just about what had happened to Terrell Washington, it was about how many others had suffered similar indignities without the benefit of viral videos to amplify their experiences. Outside Atlantic Sky's headquarters in Dallas, a protest began to form. What started as a handful of activists with handmade signs grew to hundreds of people by the following morning. They carried photos of Terrell Washington alongside signs reading, "Flying while black shouldn't be dangerous," and "Justice for Terrell, accountability for Atlantic Sky." The protest garnered local news coverage, which quickly expanded to national attention as celebrities and athletes began to share their support on social media. A prominent NBA player who had experienced similar treatment on a different airline posted a lengthy statement about the normalization of discrimination in air travel, concluding with the hashtag boycott Atlantic Sky. By the third day of the crisis, Atlantic Sky's stock had fallen 30%. Bookings plummeted as travelers actively avoided the airline, choosing competitors even when it meant paying higher fares or accepting less convenient flight times. The company's once pristine reputation lay in tatters, and the worst was yet to come. In Denver, as Terrell's condition gradually improved, the hospital became a focal point for both media attention and public support. Flowers, cards, and gifts arrived by the hundreds, not just for Terrell but for all black patients in the hospital. Local restaurants delivered meals to the medical staff caring for him, and a children's choir performed in the hospital lobby in a show of community solidarity. The outpouring reflected something larger than sympathy for one man's suffering. It represented a collective acknowledgement that what had happened to Terrell Washington could have happened to any black traveler, and that such realities were simply unacceptable in a society that claimed to value equality and justice. As Terrell began to regain strength, the first images of him in his hospital bed, pale, weakened, but alive, leaked to the press. The contrast between these photos and his professional headshots as a distinguished neurosurgeon created a powerful visual narrative about the cost of discrimination. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to saving others, nearly killed by a deliberate act of racial bias. The story continued to evolve and expand, touching on issues far beyond one flight or one airline. It became a lens through which America examined its ongoing struggles with racial equality, the power of social media to expose injustice, and the responsibility of corporations to create cultures of genuine inclusion rather than merely paying lip service to diversity. And at the center of it all, still unaware of the national conversation his experience had ignited, Terrell Washington continued his slow journey toward recovery, his personal suffering transformed into a powerful symbol of both the persistence of discrimination and the refusal to accept it as inevitable. The boardroom on the top floor of Atlantic Sky's Dallas headquarters had never felt so tense. CEO James Wilson sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his normally confident demeanor replaced by the haggard look of a man who hadn't slept in days. Around him sat the company's top executives, their expressions ranging from grim determination to barely concealed panic. "Our stock has dropped 40% in 3 days," reported the chief financial officer, a slight tremor in his usually steady voice. "Major institutional investors are calling hourly, threatening to dump their holdings if we don't take decisive action. Bookings are down 68% compared to this time last week," added the head of sales and marketing. "Our call centers are overwhelmed with cancellations. Even our most loyal customers are abandoning us." James Wilson nodded gravely, absorbing the catastrophic reports. At 60, he had navigated numerous crises throughout his career, but nothing of this magnitude. What had begun as a single incident had metastasized into an existential threat to the company he had led for 12 years. "What are our options?" he asked the room. Victoria Hayes, the company's chief operating officer and Wilson's longtime rival for the CEO position, leaned forward. At 53, Hayes had a reputation for ruthless efficiency and prioritizing the bottom line above all else. Her sleek silver bob and perpetually perfect makeup gave her the appearance of being carved from ice, an impression reinforced by her approach to management. "We need to isolate and contain this immediately," she stated, her voice clipped and decisive. "Samantha Butler becomes our scapegoat. We fire her publicly, express our shock and dismay at her actions, and position this as the work of one bad actor rather than a systemic issue." Wilson frowned. His relationship with Hayes had always been complicated. She represented the old guard of airline management, focused on metrics, efficiency, and shareholder value at the expense of customer experience and employee well-being. Wilson, while no radical reformer, had at least attempted to modernize the company's approach during his tenure. "The videos clearly show more than one employee was involved," Wilson countered. "And the leaked complaint history suggests this isn't an isolated incident. I'm not sure a simple scapegoat strategy will work here." "It's the cleanest approach," Hayes insisted. "We're hemorrhaging money every hour this continues. We need to cauterize the wound now." The debate might have continued, but the door to the boardroom opened, and the head of public relations entered with a grim expression. "Sir, there's been another leak. Someone from inside the company has released documents to the New York Times." The room fell silent as he distributed printouts of the breaking story. The headline alone caused several executives to visibly pale. "Exposed, Atlantic Sky's secret passenger value index rates customers by race, income." The article detailed an internal algorithmic tool used by Atlantic Sky to assign values to passengers based on various metrics, ostensibly to determine service priorities and resource allocation. While race was never explicitly mentioned in the algorithm's parameters, proxies such as zip code, name analysis, and historical travel patterns created a system that consistently ranked Black and Latino passengers lower than white passengers of similar income and travel frequency. "Jesus Christ," muttered the General Counsel. "This is indefensible." "Who had access to this information?" demanded Hayes, her eyes flashing with fury at the leak. "That's not the issue right now," Wilson cut in sharply. "The issue is that this system exists at all. Why am I just learning about this now?" The chief technology officer shifted uncomfortably. "The Passenger Value Index was developed under the previous administration. It's been in use for approximately 8 years, primarily to optimize service delivery and resource allocation." "Optimize service delivery," Wilson repeated, his voice hollow. "By systematically providing worse service to Black passengers." Not explicitly, the CTO attempted to clarify. "The algorithm doesn't directly consider race. It uses correlative factors that—" "Save it," Wilson interrupted. "The impact is what matters, and the impact has clearly been discriminatory." He turned to the General Counsel. "Is this legal?" The attorney's expression was grave. "It exists in a gray area. It doesn't explicitly use protected characteristics to discriminate, but the effect is discriminatory. If this goes to court, and it will, we're looking at potential violations of civil rights laws, class action lawsuits, and possibly even federal investigations." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The Passenger Value Index wasn't just a PR disaster, it was potentially criminal. While the executives grappled with this new crisis, another was unfolding at ground level. At 3 major hub airports, Atlanta, Chicago, and Dallas, Atlantic Sky employees had begun an impromptu walkout. What started with a few ground crew and gate agents had quickly spread to include flight attendants, baggage handlers, and maintenance personnel. "We refuse to work for a company that discriminates against passengers and then lies about it," declared a senior flight attendant to a gathering crowd at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. "Many of us have witnessed these practices for years and reported them through proper channels, only to be ignored or silenced." The walkouts created immediate operational chaos. Flights were delayed or cancelled as the airline scrambled to find replacement workers. Passengers stranded by the disruptions added to the growing chorus of discontent, their frustrations captured by eager news crews and shared widely on social media. Back in the boardroom, news of the employee walkouts hit like another body blow. Wilson's phone lit up with a notification from the Department of Transportation. They were launching a formal investigation into Atlantic Sky's service practices, with particular focus on potential civil rights violations. "This just keeps getting worse," the chief financial officer murmured, staring at the plummeting stock price on his tablet. Wilson stood abruptly. "I've heard enough. We need to take immediate, dramatic action if this company is going to survive." He turned to his chief of staff. "Call an all-hands virtual meeting for all management personnel in 2 hours. And prepare the broadcasting equipment in the main auditorium. I'm going to address every employee directly." Victoria Hayes watched with narrowed eyes as Wilson took command of the situation. "What exactly are you planning, James?" "The truth, Victoria. For once, we're going to try the truth." 2 hours later, Wilson stood before a camera in the company's auditorium, broadcasting to thousands of Atlantic Sky employees worldwide. His usual polished corporate appearance had been deliberately softened, no tie, collar unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up. This was not the time for CEO polish, it was time for human connection. "Today, I speak to you not just as the CEO of Atlantic Sky, but as someone who has failed you and our customers," he began, his voice steady despite the career suicide he was about to commit. "The events of the past week have exposed serious problems within our company, problems that I should have recognized and addressed long ago." He took a deep breath and continued. "The discrimination that Dr. Terrell Washington experienced was not the action of one rogue employee. It was the predictable result of systems and cultures that we have allowed to develop and persist. The recently exposed Passenger Value Index is just one example of how we have institutionalized practices that result in unequal treatment. Throughout the company, employees watched in stunned silence as their CEO acknowledged what many had known but few had dared to articulate. Effective immediately, I am shutting down the Passenger Value Index and launching a comprehensive external audit of all our service algorithms and training procedures. I am establishing an independent review board with authority to examine every aspect of our operations and recommend binding changes. Wilson's face grew even more serious. I am also announcing a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior of any kind. This applies to every employee, from myself to our newest hires. We will be implementing comprehensive anti-bias training developed and led by respected civil rights organizations, not corporate consultants. As Wilson continued outlining his plan for transforming the company, the boardroom where the executives watched the broadcast remained tensely silent. Victoria Hayes's expression had hardened into a mask of calculation. While Wilson spoke of accountability and transformation, she was already typing a message on her phone to several board members, laying the groundwork for his removal. What Wilson didn't know was that even as he made his impassioned plea for reform, the board had already scheduled an emergency session for that evening. By morning, despite the positive initial response to his candid address, James Wilson would no longer be the CEO of Atlantic Sky Airlines. In his place would stand Victoria Hayes, promising a return to stability and sensible management of the current challenges. Her first official statement as CEO struck a markedly different tone from Wilson's heartfelt admissions. While we acknowledge the unfortunate incident involving Dr. Washington, Atlantic Sky remains committed to providing excellent service to all our passengers, she declared in a pre-recorded video released to the media. The actions of one employee do not reflect our company values, and we are taking appropriate measures to ensure such an incident never happens again. Gone were Wilson's acknowledgments of systemic issues and promises of fundamental reform. In their place stood carefully crafted corporate speak, designed to minimize legal exposure and placate shareholders while doing little to address the underlying problems. The contrast between the two approaches was not lost on the public or the media. Wilson's address had begun to rebuild a modicum of trust. Hayes's statement shattered it completely. The hashtag Atlantic Sky Lies quickly joined hashtag Justice for Terrell at the top of social media trending topics. Meanwhile, at University of Colorado Hospital, there was finally some good news. After 5 days in intensive care, Terrell Washington had regained full consciousness. Though weakened and facing a long recovery, his medical team was cautiously optimistic about his prognosis. The brain damage they had feared from the anaphylactic shock had not materialized, a testament to the speed with which he had received emergency care. As Terrell slowly oriented himself to his surroundings and the events that had led to his hospitalization, he remained unaware of the national conversation his experience had sparked or the corporate drama unfolding in its wake. That would change soon enough, as his sister Aisha prepared to share with him both the outpouring of public support and her plans for holding Atlantic Sky accountable through every legal means available. The stage was now set for the next phase of the unfolding drama, a direct confrontation between a profit-focused corporation desperate to minimize its exposure and a family determined to seek not just compensation, but genuine transformation of an industry that had for too long allowed discrimination to fly under the radar. The conference room at Bennett, Washington and Associates, one of Atlanta's most prestigious civil rights law firms, hummed with purposeful energy. Aisha Washington, now back in her element after ensuring her brother's condition had stabilized, stood at the head of a large table surrounded by a team of top-tier attorneys and paralegals. Her tailored navy suit and confident stance reflected her reputation as one of the most formidable civil rights attorneys in the Southeast. "We're not just filing a personal injury lawsuit," Aisha stated, her voice clear and determined. "This is about exposing a pattern of systematic discrimination that has gone unchecked for decades. The complaint needs to be comprehensive enough to open the door for discovery of all their internal practices." Jordan Bennett, the firm's founding partner and Aisha's mentor, nodded in agreement. "We'll structure this as a $50 million lawsuit naming Atlantic Sky Airlines as the primary defendant," with additional complaints against Samantha Butler personally and Sky High Catering, the airline's food service provider. The legal team had spent the past week gathering preliminary evidence, the viral videos from the flight, testimony from cooperative passengers, leaked internal documents about Atlantic Sky's passenger value index, and medical reports detailing the severity of Terrell's condition. The deliberate nature of the harm is what makes this case so compelling, noted another senior attorney. This wasn't just negligence. The evidence suggests Samantha Butler knowingly served expired food and then deliberately withheld medical assistance. Aisha's expression hardened. And the airline enabled her behavior through years of ignoring complaints and institutionalizing discrimination with their passenger rating system. As the legal team finalized the initial filing, across the country in Washington, D.C., the FBI investigation into the incident had expanded significantly. What began as an examination of Samantha Butler's actions had grown to include multiple Atlantic Sky executives who had systematically buried previous discrimination complaints. Special Agent Dominique Vargas led the investigation, her experience in civil rights cases making her particularly suited to unraveling the complex web of corporate policies and individual actions that had culminated in the incident on Flight 247. "We need to interview this flight attendant, Michael Torres, again," she told her team, reviewing his initial statement. His testimony about the airline's internal practices could be crucial to establishing a pattern. Michael Torres had returned to his apartment in Chicago after being placed on paid administrative leave by Atlantic Sky. Ostensibly for his own protection after receiving threats from customers angry about the incident, though many suspected it was actually to keep him away from the media. When Agent Vargas contacted him to request a follow-up interview, he agreed immediately. "I've been waiting for someone to really listen," Michael said as they sat in a secure conference room at the FBI's Chicago field office. What happened to Dr. Washington wasn't an isolated incident. There's a culture at Atlantic Sky that encourages different treatment based on who the passenger is or appears to be. Can you elaborate on that? Agent Vargas prompted, recording the conversation with Michael's consent. Michael leaned forward, his expression earnest. "New flight attendants are never explicitly told to treat passengers differently based on race. That would be too obvious. Instead, there's this unspoken training that happens on the job." Senior attendants like Samantha would pull aside newer staff and talk about managing difficult passengers or prioritizing high-value customers. And how was this prioritization determined? There were codes in the passenger manifests, Michael explained. Little stars or numbers beside certain names. We were told they indicated frequent flyers or premium members, but I noticed patterns. The passengers with the highest ratings were almost always white, well-dressed business travelers. Black passengers, especially black men, rarely had these indicators, even when I knew they were frequent flyers or flying first class. This testimony aligned perfectly with the leaked passenger value index that had caused such uproar. Michael was providing the human implementation of what the algorithm had silently calculated, a system designed to provide better service to certain types of passengers at the expense of others. Meanwhile, Samantha Butler had retreated to her sister's home in a Dallas suburb, hiding from the media frenzy and public outrage. She had hired Stanley Reynolds, a high-profile defense attorney known for representing clients in controversial cases. Reynolds' strategy became clear in his first public statement about the case. "Ms. Butler has been made a scapegoat for corporate practices that she was trained and expected to follow," Reynolds declared to assembled reporters. "She is a dedicated employee who has served Atlantic Sky Airlines faithfully for 15 years. Any actions she took on Flight 247 were consistent with the training and directives she received from airline management." This attempt to shift blame upward to corporate leadership was not received well by Atlantic Sky or its new CEO. Victoria Hayes immediately issued a counter-statement disavowing Samantha's claims. Atlantic Sky Airlines categorically denies that any employee was ever trained or encouraged to discriminate against passengers based on race or any other protected characteristic. Ms. Butler's actions were in direct violation of our policies and values, and her attempt to deflect responsibility is both disappointing and false. The public battle between Samantha and her former employer created yet another dimension to the unfolding scandal. It also provided a valuable opportunity for investigators and attorneys on both sides of the case, as each party became increasingly willing to provide evidence that implicated the other. This dynamic proved particularly valuable during the discovery phase of Aisha Washington's lawsuit. Atlantic Sky's attorneys, trying to limit the company's liability by placing blame on Samantha Butler as a rogue employee, turned over internal communications that they believed would demonstrate the company's official anti-discrimination policies. What they failed to properly review were the metadata and attached conversation threads that revealed how these policies were systematically undermined in practice. One particularly damning email chain showed a regional manager instructing cabin crew supervisors to use discretion when applying service standards on routes with diverse passenger demographics. Another revealed that customer complaints about discrimination were routinely recategorized as general service issues to keep them out of civil rights compliance reports. But the most explosive discovery came from an unexpected source. Jason Parker, the white businessman who had witnessed and recorded Samantha's neglect of Terrell on the flight, came forward with additional evidence he hadn't initially shared. Before takeoff, while boarding was still underway, he had been recording a video message for his daughter's birthday on his phone. In the background, clearly audible, was a conversation between Samantha and another flight attendant discussing the special treatment certain passengers would receive. "You've got 1 and 2A, Samantha could be heard saying. Harvard Medical School lanyard but still expects first-class treatment. Just give him the minimum and he won't notice the difference. These people always complain no matter what you do." The casual nature of the conversation, clearly referencing Terrell without explicitly mentioning race, demonstrated how deeply ingrained the discriminatory practices had become. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, it was standard operating procedure. As evidence mounted against both Samantha Butler and Atlantic Sky, public pressure continued to build. The Department of Justice announced a criminal investigation into Atlantic Sky's leadership, focusing on potential violations of federal civil rights laws and public accommodations. The Department of Transportation expanded its own investigation to include all major U.S. airlines, using Atlantic Sky as a catalyst to examine industry-wide practices. In a surprising development that further damaged Atlantic Sky's attempt to contain the scandal, the company's former CEO, James Wilson, agreed to testify in Aisha's lawsuit. Having been ousted for his attempt to acknowledge and address the systemic issues within the airline, Wilson no longer felt bound by corporate loyalty. His deposition proved devastating to Atlantic Sky's defense. There was an unofficial policy, Wilson testified under oath, never written down but understood throughout upper management, that maintaining what they called certain passenger comfort levels meant catering to the preferences of our primarily white, affluent customer base. This sometimes meant providing less attentive service to passengers of color to avoid making white passengers feel that their experience was being diminished by having to share premium cabins with diverse travelers. Victoria Hayes and the Atlantic Sky Board were furious at Wilson's testimony, but they could not effectively counter it without appearing to condone discrimination. Their legal strategy began to crumble as more current and former employees came forward with similar accounts, emboldened by Wilson's candor. The final blow to Atlantic Sky's defense came during Samantha Butler's deposition. After hours of maintaining that she had followed standard procedures and denying any intentional wrongdoing, she finally broke down under Aisha Washington's relentless questioning. "Yes, I served him that meal on purpose," Samantha admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I knew it was from the day before. We were trained to provide what they called service appropriate to passenger value, and the company made it clear which passengers were valued and which weren't. Did you ignore Dr. Washington's calls for help after he became ill?" Aisha pressed. Samantha nodded, her voice barely audible. "That's what we were taught to do with certain passengers who complained. Minimize interaction, deflect their concerns, avoid creating scenes that might disturb other passengers." "Other passengers," Aisha repeated. "You mean white passengers?" "It was never stated explicitly," Samantha replied, "but yes, that was the understanding." Samantha then revealed the existence of an unofficial training manual that was passed between senior flight attendants, containing coded language for racial profiling and instructions on how to provide tiered levels of service without explicitly violating anti-discrimination laws. As the evidence continued to mount, the jury selection process began for Samantha's criminal trial for reckless endangerment and civil rights violations. The public attention surrounding the case made finding impartial jurors challenging, but eventually a diverse panel was seated. Meanwhile, Atlantic Sky made a last-ditch effort to settle Aisha's civil lawsuit before it went to trial. Their offer of $20 million plus vaguely described policy changes came with a strict non-disclosure agreement that would prevent Terrell, Aisha, and all witnesses from discussing the case publicly. Terrell, now recovered enough to participate in legal decisions though still undergoing physical therapy to regain his full strength, adamantly refused the settlement offer. "This isn't about money," he told Aisha during a strategy session at her office. "This is about making sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else. I won't be silenced." The judge presiding over the civil case, after reviewing the evidence gathered during discovery, rejected Atlantic Sky's motion to dismiss and allowed the case to proceed to trial. The airline stock, which had briefly stabilized after Hayes took over as CEO, plunged to new lows on the news. As both the criminal and civil trials approached, Terrell Washington began receiving death threats from individuals who blamed him for the airline's troubles and the potential loss of jobs if the company failed. Despite these threats, which were being investigated by the FBI, Terrell remained resolute in his determination to see the case through to its conclusion. "I've saved lives in the operating room that others had given up on," he told reporters outside the courthouse after a pre-trial hearing. "I'm not giving up on this fight for justice either, no matter how uncomfortable it makes some people." The stage was now set for a courtroom showdown that would not only determine the fate of Samantha Butler and Atlantic Sky Airlines but potentially reshape the entire transportation industry's approach to equality and discrimination. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Terrell Washington's Atlanta home, casting warm stripes across his living room as he carefully navigated his daily physical therapy routine. 6 weeks had passed since the incident on Flight 247, and though he had been discharged from the hospital 3 weeks ago, his body still bore the effects of the trauma it had endured. 10 more steps, Dr. Washington, encouraged Devin Harris, the physical therapist who visited 3 times weekly. "Your strength is improving, but we need to rebuild your endurance." Terrell nodded, determination etched across his features as he gripped the parallel bars installed temporarily in his living room. The severe food poisoning and anaphylactic shock had weakened his muscular system significantly, requiring intensive rehabilitation before he could return to the physically demanding work of neurosurgery. "How's the tremor today?" Devin asked, watching Terrell's hands closely. Terrell extended his right hand, focusing intently. The slight tremor that had developed during his recovery was his greatest concern professionally. A neurosurgeon with unsteady hands couldn't operate, no matter how brilliant their mind. "Better than yesterday," Terrell replied, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "But still not surgical quality." "You'll get there," Devin assured him. "Your body is healing remarkably well, all things considered." What Devin didn't mention, but both men knew, was that Terrell had nearly died on that airplane. The extensive blood work and tissue samples had revealed not just standard food poisoning bacteria but levels of contamination that suggested the seafood had been stored improperly for an extended period. The finding supported the growing evidence that the meal served to Terrell had been deliberately selected for its questionable quality. As Terrell completed his therapy session, his phone buzzed continuously with notifications. Since making his first public statement a week after regaining consciousness, he had become the reluctant center of a national movement. The hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack had expanded beyond his personal experience to become a platform for thousands of travelers to share their own stories of discrimination in air travel and other forms of transportation. What had begun as outrage over one incident had catalyzed a broader conversation about the everyday indignities faced by black travelers. From being consistently pulled aside for additional screening at security checkpoints to receiving subpar service in first-class cabins they had paid full price to occupy, the patterns were unmistakable once brought into the light. Terrell had initially been hesitant to embrace his new role as the face of this movement. His life had been dedicated to medicine, not activism. But as he recovered and witnessed the impact his story was having, he recognized both the responsibility and the opportunity he had been given. "Your public fundraiser has reached $2 million, Aisha informed him, arriving for their daily strategy meeting. She set her briefcase on his kitchen counter and pulled out her tablet. "People from all 50 states have contributed." Terrell shook his head in amazement. What was supposed to be a simple trip to a medical conference has turned into this. He gestured vaguely at the stack of letters, cards, and gifts that continued to arrive daily from well-wishers across the country. "We need to decide what to do with the fundraiser money," Aisha continued. "The hospital bills are covered by your insurance, and our lawsuit against Atlantic Sky will handle any additional damages." Terrell didn't hesitate. "Donate it all to transportation equality initiatives. Find organizations that are working to address discrimination in airlines, rideshares, public transit, anywhere people face these same issues." Aisha smiled, unsurprised by her brother's decision. "I thought you might say that. I've already researched some options." She showed him profiles of several nonprofit organizations focused on transportation equity and civil rights in travel. As they reviewed the possibilities, Terrell's phone rang. The caller ID showed Atlanta Medical Center, his hospital. "Dr. Washington," he answered, automatically shifting into his professional tone. "Terrell, it's Sandra from PR," came the response. "I hate to bother you during your recovery, but there's something you should know. A reporter has uncovered that you performed emergency surgery last year on Brian Butler, Samantha Butler's nephew. He was the victim of that multi-car pileup on I-85. Terrell fell silent, processing this unexpected connection. He vaguely remembered the case. A challenging brain surgery on a young man with severe trauma from a car accident. The procedure had required using the innovative technique Terrell had pioneered, and the patient had made a remarkable recovery. "Brian Butler would have died or suffered permanent brain damage without your intervention," Sandra continued. "This connection is likely to become public soon. I wanted you to be prepared." After thanking Sandra for the heads-up, Terrell shared the information with Aisha, whose legal mind immediately began calculating how this might affect their case. "This adds another layer to the story," she noted. "You literally saved her family member's life, and months later, she nearly took yours." Terrell sat heavily on his sofa, struck by the tragic irony. "I didn't know he was related to her. I never know whose lives I'm saving in the operating room. That's the point, it doesn't matter who they are." The revelation about Brian Butler hit the media the following day, creating yet another wave of outrage. The contrast between Terrell's professional ethics in treating all patients equally and the discrimination he had faced further highlighted the moral bankruptcy of Atlantic Sky's practices. Meanwhile, the airline was growing increasingly desperate to resolve the situation. Victoria Hayes authorized a new settlement offer, $20 million to Terrell personally, plus an additional $30 million to fund transportation equity initiatives of his choosing. The offer came with the same strict non-disclosure agreement, effectively buying his silence. The offer arrived via courier to Aisha's office, where she and Terrell were meeting with their legal team. After reviewing the terms, Terrell didn't even need time to consider. "No," he said firmly. "They still don't understand. This isn't about money. This is about changing a system that treats people differently based on the color of their skin. No amount of money with a gag order attached will accomplish that." Instead of accepting the settlement, Terrell took a bold step that caught both Atlantic Sky and the public by surprise. He called a press conference, his first major public appearance since the incident, and announced the creation of the Transportation Equality Foundation, funded initially by the $2 million raised through public donations. Standing at the podium, still visibly thinner than he had been before the incident but with his natural dignity intact, Terrell addressed the cameras directly. "What happened to me on Atlantic Sky Flight 247 was not an isolated incident," he stated, his voice steady and clear. It was the product of a system that has normalized discrimination to the point where serving spoiled food to a black passenger seemed acceptable. Rather than focus solely on my experience, I want to use this platform to ensure that all travelers can move through the world with dignity and safety, regardless of their race. He then announced the Foundation's first initiative, the #FlyingWhileBlack documentation campaign, encouraging travelers to record and report discriminatory treatment across all airlines and transportation services. Only by bringing these practices into the light can we hope to eliminate them, Terrell explained. This isn't about vilifying one airline or one flight attendant. This is about transforming an entire industry. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Major celebrities and athletes publicly endorsed the campaign, with many sharing their own experiences of discrimination while traveling. A prominent basketball player described being seated in economy despite having purchased a first-class ticket, only to be told there were no more seats available, until he produced evidence of his reservation. An acclaimed actress recounted being repeatedly asked to verify her boarding pass while seated in first class, while white passengers around her were never questioned. These high-profile endorsements amplified the campaign's reach, but it was the thousands of stories from ordinary travelers that created the most powerful narrative. The pattern of discrimination became impossible to ignore as video after video, testimony after testimony, revealed consistent disparities in treatment across multiple airlines and transportation services. The Department of Transportation, already investigating Atlantic Sky, announced an industry-wide audit of airline practices related to customer service and discrimination. Transportation Secretary Lisa Chin issued a statement pledging thorough examination of everything from crew training materials to algorithms used for passenger service prioritization. Every American has the right to safe, respectful transportation services, Secretary Chin declared. The disturbing patterns emerging from the #FlyingWhileBlack campaign suggest that this right is not being equally extended to all travelers. The unprecedented regulatory attention sent shockwaves through the airline industry. Several major carriers, seeing the writing on the wall, proactively announced reviews of their own service policies and training programs. Some hired independent civil rights auditors to evaluate their practices, eager to avoid becoming the next Atlantic Sky. For Atlantic Sky itself, the situation continued to deteriorate. With their settlement offers rejected and public opinion firmly against them, bookings plummeted to 70% below normal levels. Industry analysts began openly discussing the possibility of bankruptcy, speculating that the airline might not survive the quarter without drastic intervention. Victoria Hayes, facing increasing pressure from the board and shareholders, made one final desperate attempt to salvage the company's reputation. She offered Terrell a position on a newly formed Passenger Equality Advisory Board, with a generous compensation package and the promise of influence over company policies. Terrell declined politely but firmly. Real change doesn't come from advisory boards with no actual authority, he told reporters when asked about the offer. It comes from fundamental shifts in corporate culture and accountability for past wrongs. As Terrell's public profile grew, so did the threats against him. Anonymous messages promised violence if he didn't stop destroying American jobs by continuing his campaign against Atlantic Sky. His home address was doxed on extremist forums, forcing him to temporarily relocate for safety. The FBI assigned agents to investigate the threats, taking them seriously enough to provide Terrell with a security detail for public appearances. Despite these challenges, Terrell's recovery continued to progress. 3 months after the incident, his hand tremor had finally subsided enough for him to begin practicing surgical techniques again, first on simulations and eventually on cadavers at the medical center's training facility. The day he successfully completed his first post-recovery practice surgery, a complex procedure requiring absolute precision, marked a personal turning point. That evening, as he sat with Aisha on the balcony of his temporary apartment, watching the Atlanta skyline shift from day to night, he allowed himself to acknowledge both how far he had come and how far he still had to go. "I'm going back to the operating room next month," he told her, a quiet pride in his voice. "Part-time at first, but I'm ready." Aisha squeezed his hand. "You never cease to amaze me, Terrell. Most people would still be focused solely on their recovery after what you went through. I can do both, he replied simply. Help patients in the operating room and help change this broken system. Maybe that's why this happened to me, because I have the platform and the privilege to speak out in ways others can't. As twilight deepened into night, brother and sister sat in companionable silence, watching the city lights emerge like stars against the darkening sky. Neither could have predicted the path their lives had taken since that fateful flight, but both were committed to seeing it through to its conclusion, not just for justice in one case, but for lasting change that would protect countless travelers in the future. The federal courthouse in Denver stood imposing against the clear blue Colorado sky, its neoclassical architecture projecting the solemnity of justice. Television news crews lined the wide steps leading to the entrance, their satellite trucks creating a media encampment that had been growing since dawn. Today marked the beginning of United States versus Butler, the criminal trial against Samantha Butler for reckless endangerment and civil rights violations. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension as federal prosecutors and defense attorneys made their final preparations. At the defendant's table, Samantha Butler sat beside her attorney, Stanley Reynolds. Her once perfect appearance had deteriorated over the months of legal proceedings and public scrutiny. Her blonde hair, now showing dark roots, was pulled back in a severe ponytail, and her face, devoid of the immaculate makeup she had worn as a flight attendant, revealed the strain of someone facing potential years in prison. Across the aisle, Assistant U.S. Attorney Janelle Ramirez reviewed her opening statement one final time. With 15 years of experience prosecuting civil rights cases, Ramirez had been specially selected to lead this high-profile prosecution. She looked up briefly as Terrell Washington entered the courtroom, accompanied by his sister Aisha and his security detail. Though not a direct participant in the criminal proceedings, Terrell would be the prosecution's key witness, his testimony crucial to establishing the severity of harm caused by Samantha's actions. Judge Anthony Morales entered the courtroom, his reputation for no-nonsense efficiency preceding him. After the formalities of calling the court to order, the trial began with opening statements. Ramirez approached the jury box with measured steps, her dark suit and confident bearing commanding immediate attention. This case is about more than a meal served on an airplane, she began, her voice resonating throughout the hushed courtroom. It is about a deliberate choice to endanger a human being based on the color of his skin. The evidence will show that the defendant, Samantha Butler, knowingly served spoiled food to Dr. Terrell Washington and then deliberately ignored his calls for help as he suffered a life-threatening reaction. These actions weren't just negligent, they were criminal. When Stanley Reynolds rose for the defense's opening statement, his strategy became immediately clear. Ms. Butler is not the villain the media has portrayed her to be, he insisted, gesturing toward his client. She is a scapegoat for an airline that trained, encouraged, and rewarded discriminatory practices. Yes, mistakes were made on Flight 247, but responsibility lies primarily with the corporate culture that shaped Ms. Butler's actions, not with her alone. Over the next 3 days, the prosecution built its case methodically. Flight attendant Michael Torres provided damning testimony about Samantha's behavior on the flight and the airline's unwritten policies of differential treatment. I saw her deliberately ignore Dr. Washington's call button at least 6 times, Michael testified. When I asked if she was going to check on him, she said, and I quote, "He's just looking for attention. These people always want special treatment." The prosecution introduced video evidence from multiple passengers' phones, showing Samantha's dismissive attitude before Terrell's collapse and her attempt to dispose of evidence afterward. The medical experts who had treated Terrell in Denver testified to the severity of his condition upon arrival at the hospital, emphasizing how close he had come to death. On the 4th day, Terrell himself took the stand. Dressed in a charcoal suit with a subtle burgundy tie, he presented the same dignified composure that had made him such a compelling figure throughout the unfolding scandal. When asked to recount his experience on the flight, he spoke with clinical precision, his medical training evident in his detailed description of his symptoms and deterioration. "I knew within minutes that the seafood was contaminated," Terrell testified. "As a physician, I recognized the rapid onset of symptoms as indicative of severe bacterial food poisoning," potentially life-threatening if not treated promptly. And what happened when you attempted to get assistance? Ramirez asked. I signaled for the flight attendant repeatedly. Ms. Butler looked directly at me multiple times but continued serving other passengers. By the time my condition had deteriorated to the point of collapse, approximately 15 minutes had passed with no response to my calls for help. The most dramatic moment of Terrell's testimony came when Ramirez asked him about the long-term impacts of the incident. I lost 23 pounds during my hospitalization, Terrell explained. The tremor in my hands that developed during recovery nearly ended my career as a neurosurgeon. I've spent hundreds of hours in physical therapy to regain the fine motor control necessary to perform delicate brain surgeries. Even now, 6 months later, I still don't have the stamina I once did. During cross-examination, Reynolds attempted to shift focus away from Terrell's suffering and back to Atlantic Sky's corporate culture. Dr. Washington, are you aware that Atlantic Sky Airlines had a passenger rating system that systematically categorized travelers by demographic factors? Reynolds asked. Objection, Ramirez interjected. Relevance to this defendant's actions. Your Honor, it goes to the environment in which my client was operating, Reynolds argued. I'll allow it, but keep it focused, Counselor, Judge Morales ruled. Terrell's response was measured. I've become aware of such a system through media reports and discovery in the civil case against Atlantic Sky. However, knowledge of such a system doesn't excuse deliberately serving spoiled food to a passenger or ignoring their medical emergency. The trial took an unexpected turn when the defense called former Atlantic Sky CEO James Wilson to testify. Wilson, still bitter about his ousting after attempting to address the company's discriminatory practices, proved more helpful to the prosecution than the defense. Atlantic Sky had an unofficial policy of providing different levels of service based on what we euphemistically called passenger value, Wilson testified. While race was never explicitly mentioned in training materials, the practical effect was that white passengers received preferential treatment compared to passengers of color, particularly in premium cabins. And how was this policy communicated to flight attendants like Ms. Butler? Reynolds asked. Through a combination of informal training, mentorship from senior staff, and implicit rewards, Wilson explained. Flight attendants who maintained what management called cabin harmony, which in practice meant catering to the comfort of white passengers, sometimes at the expense of passengers of color, received better performance reviews, preferable routes, and faster promotion. While this testimony supported Reynolds' argument that Samantha was a product of a discriminatory system, it did little to excuse her specific actions toward Terrell. If anything, it painted her as a willing participant in institutionalized racism rather than an unwitting pawn. The most damaging testimony for Samantha came from an unexpected source. Jason Parker, the white businessman who had been seated across from Terrell in first class, revealed during his testimony that he had additional evidence beyond what had previously been disclosed. Before takeoff, I was recording a video message for my daughter's birthday, Jason explained, his expression grim. In the background, I inadvertently captured a conversation between Ms. Butler and another flight attendant. The courtroom fell completely silent as the prosecution played the audio recording. Samantha's voice came through clearly, "You've got 1 in 2A. Harvard Medical School lanyard but still expects first-class treatment. Just give him the minimum and he won't notice the difference. These people always complain no matter what you do." The recording continued, capturing Samantha and her colleague discussing how they would handle difficult passengers on the flight, with coded language that clearly indicated racial profiling. The jury's expressions reflected their understanding of the implications. Several visibly recoiled at the casual prejudice displayed in the conversation. Samantha's own testimony, when she finally took the stand, began with defiance but crumbled under Ramirez's skilled cross-examination. "Did you check the date on the seafood meal you served to Dr. Washington?" Ramirez asked directly. "I don't recall specifically checking that particular meal," Samantha replied evasively. Ramirez approached with a piece of evidence. "This is the Atlantic Sky Flight Attendant Manual, Section 4.3, covering food safety protocols. Please read the highlighted portion aloud. Samantha's voice faltered slightly as she read, "Flight attendants must verify the date on all meal packaging before serving. Items past their labeled date must never be served and should be reported to catering services immediately." So this was a clear violation of protocol, correct? Ramirez pressed. Yes, but in the rush of service. Ms. Butler, Ramirez interrupted, security footage from the galley shows you examining the date label on Dr. Washington's meal, does it not? After a long pause, Samantha admitted, yes. And despite seeing that date, you served it anyway, correct? Another pause. Yes. The admission sent ripples through the courtroom. Ramirez continued methodically, establishing that Samantha had deliberately ignored Terrell's calls for assistance and attempted to dispose of evidence afterward. By the time Reynolds began his redirect examination, Samantha appeared defeated. In a desperate attempt to salvage his client's case, Reynolds guided her toward the corporate culture defense. Ms. Butler, tell us about the training you received regarding passenger value and service priorities. What happened next stunned everyone in the courtroom. Samantha, perhaps recognizing that her fate was already sealed, broke down completely. We were taught to provide what they called service appropriate to passenger value, she sobbed. There was this unofficial manual passed between senior attendants. It never explicitly mentioned race, but everyone understood what it meant. Black passengers in first class were to be given minimum required service. If they complained, we were supposed to ignore them or respond slowly to discourage inappropriate behavior. Inappropriate behavior meaning what? Reynolds asked gently. Meaning existing in spaces where they weren't traditionally welcome, Samantha admitted, her voice barely audible. The courtroom erupted in murmurs at this admission. Judge Morales had to call for order several times before silence was restored. Reynolds, recognizing the damaging nature of this testimony despite its support for his corporate culture argument, quickly concluded his questioning. During closing arguments, Ramirez emphasized Samantha's personal responsibility despite the toxic environment in which she operated. Many Atlantic Sky employees faced the same corporate culture as Ms. Butler, she reminded the jury. Yet Michael Torres chose to help Dr. Washington. Others have come forward as whistleblowers rather than perpetuate discrimination. Ms. Butler made her choices, and those choices nearly cost a man his life. Reynolds, in his closing, continued to argue that Samantha was a product of a system designed to discriminate and that the true criminals are the executives who created and maintained that system while hiding behind plausible deniability. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Samantha Butler's face remained impassive as Judge Morales scheduled sentencing for the following month. Outside the courthouse, Terrell addressed the waiting media briefly. Today's verdict is just one step toward accountability. The larger issue of systemic discrimination in transportation remains to be addressed. That work continues. As news of the guilty verdict spread, Atlantic Sky made one final, desperate attempt to settle the civil lawsuit before it went to trial. The new offer removed the non-disclosure agreement and included a public admission of fault, but Terrell and Aisha, after consultation with their legal team, declined again. The evidence gathered during discovery was too important to keep from the public record. The civil trial against Atlantic Sky Airlines needed to proceed. What no one anticipated was that the former Atlantic Sky CEO, James Wilson, motivated by either conscience or revenge for his ousting, would contact Aisha Washington with information that would blow the case wide open. The existence of an internal company document detailing the explicit strategy to provide different levels of service based on passenger demographics while maintaining plausible deniability about racial discrimination. This document, which came to be known as the Atlantic Sky Playbook, would prove to be the final nail in the company's coffin and set the stage for unprecedented industry-wide reforms. 8 months after the incident on Flight 247, Samantha Butler stood before Judge Anthony Morales for sentencing. The crowded courtroom fell silent as she faced the consequences of her actions. Ms. Butler, Judge Morales began, his deep voice carrying the weight of justice, "This court has found you guilty of reckless endangerment and violation of civil rights under color of authority. Your deliberate actions placed Dr. Terrell Washington in life-threatening danger and violated his fundamental right to equal treatment in public accommodations." Samantha stared straight ahead, her posture rigid but her eyes revealing the fear she tried to conceal. "While I acknowledge the role that corporate culture played in fostering discriminatory practices, this court cannot accept the argument that you were merely following implicit directives. Each of us bears personal responsibility for our actions, particularly when those actions endanger human life." Judge Morales paused, reviewing the sentencing recommendations before him. "It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 5 years." The sentence, harsher than many legal analysts had predicted, sent a clear message about the seriousness with which the justice system was treating this case. As Samantha was led away by court officers, her previously defiant demeanor had crumbled entirely, the reality of her sentence visibly sinking in. For Terrell Washington, who had attended the sentencing with Aisha, the moment brought complex emotions. There was no joy in seeing another person's freedom curtailed, but there was a sense of justice served and acknowledgement of the severity of what had happened to him. The criminal case had concluded, but the civil trial against Atlantic Sky was just beginning. The proceedings had taken on even greater significance after federal prosecutors announced indictments against 3 former Atlantic Sky executives, including Victoria Hayes, on conspiracy charges related to discriminatory practices and obstruction of justice. The evidence provided by James Wilson, particularly the Atlantic Sky Playbook, had proven devastating. The document detailed strategies for implementing tiered service levels based on passenger value indicators that served as proxies for race and socioeconomic status while maintaining plausible deniability about discrimination. One particularly damning section provided scripts for responding to complaints from black passengers, with suggestions to acknowledge concerns without admitting fault and offer minimal compensation compared to standard resolution packages. Another outlined how to maintain cabin harmony by providing enhanced attention to majority passengers who may be uncomfortable with changing passenger demographics in premium cabins. As this evidence was presented in open court during the civil trial, Atlantic Sky's legal defense crumbled. After just 4 days of testimony, the airline's board of directors overrode CEO Victoria Hayes and instructed their attorneys to seek a settlement agreement with Terrell and the class of passengers who had joined the lawsuit. The settlement negotiations, conducted under the supervision of Judge Maria Rodriguez, resulted in an unprecedented agreement. Atlantic Sky would pay $75 million in damages to Terrell Washington and the class members, but more importantly, would agree to a comprehensive set of reforms monitored by an independent civil rights commission for a minimum of 10 years. The most revolutionary aspect of Judge Rodriguez's ruling was that she extended the monitoring requirements beyond Atlantic Sky to the entire airline industry. Citing the evidence of industry-wide discrimination patterns revealed during discovery, she ordered all major U.S. carriers to submit to anti-discrimination audits and implement similar reforms. The patterns revealed in this case suggest that discriminatory practices are not limited to one airline but represent a systemic issue across the transportation sector, Judge Rodriguez wrote in her ruling. The right to equal treatment in public accommodations is fundamental and requires industry-wide accountability measures to ensure compliance. The airline industry initially pushed back against this broad application, but public opinion had shifted decisively. The hundreds of testimonies gathered through Terrell's #FlyingWhileBlack campaign had created an undeniable record of discrimination that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. Congress seized the moment to pass the Transportation Equality and Accountability Act, commonly known as the Washington Act, in reference to Terrell. The legislation required transparency in customer service metrics by race, gender, and other protected characteristics, with substantial penalties for companies found to have disparate treatment patterns. Terrell used a portion of his settlement money to permanently endow the Transportation Equality Foundation, which expanded beyond its initial focus on airlines to address discrimination in all forms of public transportation. The foundation established a hotline for reporting incidents, provided legal assistance to affected travelers, and conducted regular audits of transportation providers' practices. 1 year after the incident on Flight 247, Terrell had fully recovered physically and returned to his neurosurgery practice full-time. His experience had changed him, however, broadening his vision of what it meant to heal. While he continued saving lives in the operating room, he now dedicated 1 week each month to his work with the foundation, understanding that systemic change could ultimately protect more lives than his surgical skills alone. Atlantic Sky Airlines, unable to recover from the financial and reputational damage of the scandal, underwent a complete transformation. The company rebranded as Horizon Air, with an entirely new management team and board of directors committed to becoming the industry leader in equitable service. They hired Michael Torres, whose whistleblower testimony had been crucial to exposing the truth, as their chief compliance officer. The most powerful symbol of the industry's transformation came when President Kamala Harris invited Terrell to the White House for the signing of an executive order on transportation equality. The order extended the Washington Act's requirements to federal transportation contracts and established a Transportation Civil Rights Office within the Department of Transportation. Dr. Washington's courage in speaking truth to power has transformed not just one airline, but our entire approach to ensuring equal treatment in transportation, President Harris declared at the signing ceremony. His experience, though tragic, has created lasting change that will benefit generations of travelers. After the ceremony, Terrell returned to Atlanta to prepare for his next journey. He had accepted an invitation to fly on Horizon Air's inaugural flight under its new management and equity-focused service model. The symbolism was powerful. The same airline that had nearly killed him was now implementing the reforms his advocacy had sparked. As Terrell boarded the flight in Atlanta, bound for San Francisco, the same route he had attempted to fly that fateful day, he was greeted by a diverse flight crew trained under the new equality standards his case had helped establish. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Washington," the lead flight attendant said warmly, genuine respect in her eyes. "It's an honor to have you with us today." Terrell took his seat in first class, the same cabin where he had once been treated as less than human. Now, he observed as the crew provided attentive, respectful service to every passenger regardless of race, gender, or appearance. The transformation was visible not just in the airline's procedures but in the atmosphere of the cabin itself, relaxed, welcoming, and truly first class for everyone. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored today to have with us Dr. Terrell Washington, whose courage and advocacy have helped create a more equitable travel experience for all of us. Dr. Washington, on behalf of our entire team, thank you for giving us the opportunity to demonstrate our commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect." Spontaneous applause broke out throughout the cabin, passengers turning to acknowledge Terrell with nods of appreciation and respect. The moment was bittersweet, a recognition of both how far things had come and how unnecessary the suffering had been that prompted these changes. In the final scene of this transformative journey, the epilogue revealed that Terrell's foundation had documented an 80% reduction in reported discrimination incidents across the transportation industry in the year following the implementation of the Washington Act. The incident that had nearly claimed his life had indeed become a case study in both medical schools, examining the rapid response to anaphylaxis, and in business ethics courses, demonstrating how systemic discrimination can be confronted and dismantled. The ultimate symbol of this transformation stood at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a monument dedicated to transportation equality, bearing a simple but powerful inscription, "Equal dignity in travel for all." And below it, in smaller letters, "Inspired by the courage of Dr. Terrell Washington and all who stood for justice." What began with a flight attendant serving spoiled food to a black passenger had culminated in a nationwide reckoning with discrimination in transportation. The chaos that erupted on that plane had ultimately led to a more just and equitable system for all travelers, proof that even the most painful experiences can, when confronted with courage and determination, lead to transformative change. This story illustrates how a single act of discrimination can expose an entire system of injustice. Dr. Terrell Washington's experience reveals that racism often operates through institutionalized practices rather than just individual actions. When organizations create cultures that normalize differential treatment, they enable harmful behaviors that can have life-threatening consequences. The journey from victim to advocate demonstrates the power of transforming personal suffering into systemic change. Rather than seeking private revenge or financial compensation, Terrell chose to create transparency and accountability that benefited everyone. His story teaches us that true justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoers but reforming broken systems. We also learn that silence and complicity allow discrimination to flourish. While many witnessed the different treatment of passengers, only a few spoke up initially. Change began when people like Michael Torres and Jason Parker refused to remain silent about the injustice they witnessed. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that discrimination in everyday services, like air travel, reflects deeper societal inequalities. The phrase, "flying while black," echoes other painful realities like driving while black or shopping while black, highlighting how racism restricts freedom of movement and access to public spaces for people of color. Real progress requires both individual courage and institutional accountability. One person speaking truth to power can ignite transformation, but lasting change demands new systems, laws, and cultural shifts. What everyday discrimination have you witnessed or experienced in transportation, retail, or other public services? Share your story in the comments to continue raising awareness. Has this narrative changed how you'll respond if you see someone being treated unfairly? Hit the like button if you believe in the power of speaking up against injustice, and subscribe for more stories that highlight the ongoing struggle for equality in America. Don't forget to share this video with someone who might gain perspective from Terrell's journey. Thank you for listening with an open heart and mind. Together, we can create a world where dignity and respect aren't determined by the color of one's skin.